Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to today's session of the Global Markets Encounter. I can already see Jim is ready. But before we move over to Jim, let me remind you that it is taking place in two languages, English and French. So please use the button at the bottom right corner to select the language of your choice. And you can also mute the original language if you don't want to hear the voice of Jim whilst he speaks. You also can use the Q&A button and also use that session for providing your questions, even though the opportunity is also there for you to raise your hand during the Q&A session and to also be given the chance to show your video and ask your questions. Again, there is the chat for networking. Do as much networking as you can, put information there as you want, and let us connect with each other. Finally, before I move on, let me also say a word of gratitude to our sponsors and partners who have made this possible. Here I'm talking about ProCashew, I'm talking about SNI, Sustainable Finance Initiative, I'm talking about ComCashew, I'm talking about Intersnack Procurement, TechnoServe Benin Cashew, and Cashew Info. Now, on to today's session, we are going to be talking about African cashews for sustainability, and I think there will be special emphasis on production. So, Jim, welcome, and it's nice to see such a beautiful cashew tree in the background. Where in Burkina Faso are you now? It looks really like a beautiful tree I've seen in the past.
This is the cashew tree in our back garden here. We've been enthusiastically increasing the Irish cashew crop.
Oh, okay. Future competition, I see.
Yes.
All right, so please, over to you, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We're going to talk about sustainability and African cashews for sustainability this morning. And in particular, we were going to get into production and we were going to get into some detail on the reasons for production in Africa being the best place to grow cashews. But unfortunately, we don't have the speakers that we hoped to have for various technical reasons. So you're stuck with me, I'm afraid. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the markets, because although we hadn't expected to talk about the markets this morning, there's compelling reason to talk about recent developments in the markets. And then we'll talk about sustainability for African cashews, and we'll finish with a question and answer session. So let's move on and have a look at these markets this morning. So there's two questions. I'm going to break this session into two areas. One is the 2021 cashew season at a crossroads? In other words, are we at a critical time where the direction may change? And then we look at on a much bigger picture, we look at the whole sector in Africa, and we'll ask the question, are we at a crossroads for sustainable sourcing that will bring African cashews to the forefront, and particularly processing? Because I think we can already say that in terms of production, African cashews are already at the forefront. So two questions. And in a way, we're talking about the choices and we're talking about the options that present themselves at this time, both in the short term and in the long term. Let's focus on the market. And I'll start maybe by just looking at some of the key dynamics. If you were with us the last time, you might recall that we talked about key dynamics at this time of the year and what makes the market move and what makes the market work and what potentially can make the market react. First key dynamic we talked about was the calendar. Now, if we see a situation where crops are delayed, as may well be the case, this 55% of the crop which is harvested between March and June gets shifted to the right. the availability of those raw nuts moves a bit later in the year, and a gap is created here, perhaps in March, perhaps in April. And where is that gap created? Of course, it's created in the countries which process the cashew nuts. So that's the first key dynamic to have a think about this morning. Secondly, we talked about the dynamics of Vietnam at this time of year. And I wanted to draw your attention particularly to the situation for Vietnamese processors during February, March, and early April. They'd be buying their own crop, they'd be buying the Cambodian crop, both clearly close at hand, and they would effectively be running a short position. They will have forward sales, and they will need to buy. Their focus is on price, and they mostly rely on traders and importers for supply. And the key factor at this time of year from the Vietnamese perspective is that although only about 18% of the world crop is harvested in Southeast Asia, the impact of any disruption to that on the overall psychology and sentiment in the market is huge. And you've only got to think back to 2017 to see the impact that a short crop or a late crop, or even the thought that there might be one, as was the case in 2017, can have on the market. We also talked about India, and we talked about India in a similar position, although not as critical. Usually because the Indian crop is larger, Indian processors don't sell as far forward because the nature of their market is a prompt and a spot market. So Indian buyers will be anticipating demand, whereas Vietnamese processors, particularly the large ones, may well be meeting demand that they've already contracted. And the fourth of the dynamics that we talked about was from the buyer's perspective, the retailer, the roaster, and the importer. And we talked about what's their position, where are they right now in terms of their forward buying, their demand, how much has each bought and sold, at what prices, how they see the year unfolding, what level of risk they're taking, and what level of risk they might be prepared to take. Key dynamics that change the sentiment. We're not actually talking in any of those about the facts. What we're talking about is how people react to the facts and what that might mean for the market. Now let's have a look and see what's changed since we had that conversation last time. Bring you back again, even further, back to the 10th of February, and we talked about La Nina and the potential climate impact of La Nina on the cashew crop. And we talked about the precedent going way back to 1998, 99, 2007, and 2010. In each case, this phenomenon appeared to have an impact, or you can at least draw a correlation between the incidence of La Nina and poor cashew crops on those three occasions. It doesn't happen very often. That's why we only have 3 examples to talk about. And way back on the 10th of February, I talked about this being a long shot, that the crop reports were still very positive, but we should be aware. Now, on the 17th of March, just over a month later, I'm starting to look at this and think there may be something to this. We may well be looking at some disruption to crops. So what has changed? What has changed between the 10th of February, when that was an idea, and the 17th of March, where there appears to be some reality and some substance to that idea? First of all, if we listen in Vietnam, and if we look at the price at the farm gate in Vietnam, we can see that Vietnamese traders and brokers and processors, this morning I was talking to one, are talking about a lower crop instead of what was earlier talked about as a late crop. And that's often the way in cashews, as you may well know. People start talking about, oh, the crop is delayed, it's coming, and then that changes. Well, maybe it's not as big as we thought it was. And that's why when I often say that late crops tend to turn into lower crops, I'm not really talking about cashew trees or features of production. I'm talking about the way people report it and how the market reacts, the market sentiment, and those key dynamics in that sentiment. Secondly, in Cambodia, it looks like it does look like the crop is bigger than last year, but it's lower than expected. It's up by less. So I think we were hoping for a crop of perhaps more than 250,000 tons. Today, it looks like it's significantly less than that. If we look at the trade into Vietnam during February, it's up on last year, but don't forget last year was the most unusual year. If we compare it, perhaps a better comparison is 2019, where the trade is significantly down during February. Now that could mean the crop is just late. We shouldn't make the conclusion that the crop is small, and still the forecasts in Cambodia are around this 250,000 ton mark. In India, some states, and this is not science, this is news reports, are reporting a later crop, and one or two are reporting a lower crop. And this is at the moment quite, in terms of its market information, it's quite spotty news. But I did read a report recently from one district in Andhra Pradesh that they expected a much reduced crop. But I'm not saying at this moment that I think the Indian crop will necessarily be smaller, but we are hearing from India that it will be later. And finally, there are reports now, and if you read the cashew splits from ACA this week, you'll see a report telling us that the first crop was a little bit lower than expected in Côte d'Ivoire. Again, we'd still expect a good crop, but that is a signal. Earlier, we'd heard some comments regarding the lack of rainfall in the northern part of the country, and that might have an impact. So when we have a look at this on the supply side, the situation from relatively optimistic initial crop forecasts all around, from governments, from traders, from ourselves, this is now getting worse. The forecasts are being reduced. We need to be careful not to draw too dramatic conclusions from this, but we can see, for example, that the price at the farm gate in Vietnam has risen. I saw in the Cashew Week recently 37,000 dong for dried cashews. Chatting to someone this morning, they were telling me that undried around about 30,000 they'd heard traded. On the demand side, we're looking at the rampant exports from Vietnam continuing. Remarkable January figures for exports. Exports so far are well up on 2020 and even more up on 2019, which actually might be a better gauge of where we stand. Imports are, again, also dramatically ahead of 2020. I think it's over 240,000 tons imported to Vietnam so far, which sounds an impressive figure and is indeed an impressive figure compared to previous January's Jan-Feb periods. But if we look at it, the increased imports don't actually cover the increased exports from Vietnam at this particular moment in time. We are seeing that Indian demand is recovering. Now, this is, of course, a critical factor. India is the largest consumer of cashews in the world. Last year, cashew consumption had been somewhat impacted by the coronavirus. We did see a recovery towards the end of the year, but it would be a critical factor if Indian demand were to return to normal, as is forecast by many observers in India. And finally, we look at prices, and prices have changed slightly. We've seen a spike up in prices. And if you look at the trend on the screen, you can see that really, I would call it the dip after the Tet holidays in Vietnam. This has bounced back to a large extent, probably more so with high quality processors with food safety certification. A BRC or an IFS processor is probably marking their prices up more. Forward prices are being marked up more than nearby prices. Vietnamese processors are now working their way through their stock. They'll be receiving imported material, and they'll be waiting anxiously for their own crop and further arrivals from Cambodia. The big question for us, of course, is what will that mean in Africa? And that we'll have a look in a minute. But let's look at this Vietnamese situation a little bit more closely. So early this year, this is a chart comparing 19, 20, 21, January, February imports. And you can see that the February imports were way up. I'd rather judge this against 2019, a more normal year, but you can see that the imports are absolutely sky high compared to previous years, up 34%. And we would then expect in March that this figure, the 2021 figure, you would hope would move up, but it probably won't, because if you think about it, what's been available during January for shipment, that's the material that will arrive in March. And if we think about, if we look at Tanzania, for example, already Vietnam has purchased large volumes from Tanzania, and that material has arrived. So what's to come in March? We would be relying on early shipments from West Africa, I think, and maybe some balances from Mozambique. If we look at exports, and now we're talking about kernels, of course, we see a really strong performance. Now, this means if we look at it, we're talking about Vietnam. We're talking about Vietnam comprising about 90% of North American imports, somewhere in the region of 80% of European imports. So these two key markets, between them around about 40% of world demand, these two key markets are buying mainly in Vietnam, and you can see that there's a really strong shipment pattern during January and February, which will be mainly to those markets as well as all the other smaller markets around the world. It is surprising that those figures would be so strong. It's not surprising that figures would be up. We would expect that, but that they would be up so far ahead of the 2019 and even the 2020 figures. Is it an anomaly? Well, what factors might suggest to us that that is an anomaly? It could be that people anticipated disruptions on freight, and we know that container freight is difficult at the moment. We know that freight rates are high. It could be that people were anticipating a problem with the crop, but personally, I don't think so. I don't think people had anticipated that, although I do think one or two traders probably spotted that. One or two are particularly active in Vietnam, and they spotted that a little bit earlier than others. I don't think that this is because of a hugely reduced inventory in Western countries. I think this is simply due to a continued pattern of strong demand, businesses trying to manage strong demand at a time when the supply chain is disrupted. But we do need to watch this carefully. And again, the March figure will be quite interesting, because if we go by March, April, we start to get back into the busy season in the Western markets. So we start to get into the season where peak demand starts to kick in over the July, August, September period. And there's not going to, it looks like there's not going to be any let up in the development of demand during 2021. And bear in mind, no matter where the price goes now, no matter how high or how low it goes, consumers in those countries have no impact of price whatsoever at this moment in time. They will buy cashews for lots of reasons, but it's unlikely to be because they're cheap. They will buy them and they will continue to buy them. So an increase in price in the short term does not mean a dent to consumer demand in Western countries. It could well do in India because it's a spot prompt market. It may do in Japan. It may do in China for the same reason, but it's unlikely in the Western countries to have that impact. So looking at the Vietnamese situation, and I'm spending time on this because the sentiment in Vietnam is critical to the development of RCN buying. And it's there in Vietnam that we have the question mark over the crop. So if the crop is late, we should see the supply of kernels get quite tight, which might mean that RCN is needed earlier. If it turns out that the Vietnamese crop is lower, especially if it's significantly lower than expected, then obviously more RCN will be needed, and it will be needed earlier. So that will have an impact on demand. It will have an impact on the flow of cash into the market. It will have an impact eventually, perhaps at the farm gate. And if we look at the situation in Vietnam right now, and obviously there's no certainty on these figures. We know what the exports are. We know what the imports are. We have some idea on the crop, and we have to estimate opening stocks and the current stocks. So the crop, by the way, the crop figure here, just to be very clear about it, the green is what we would expect to have arrived at this moment. It's not a crop forecast. The crop forecast will be up here, 350, 380,000 tons. This is what we would expect to have arrived at this stage. And this is what we think would be the impact if there was a 4-week delay. And you can see the impact that has. So this is the important number over here, the available stock at the 1st of March. Now, at this time of year, you wouldn't expect processors, importers, or traders to be carrying large volumes of stock. The green bar represents about 1 month's processing based on current exports, domestic consumption in Vietnam. The green bar represents about 1 month. If the crop were delayed by 4 weeks, that's where we stand as of the 1st of March. So this is where you get starting to get this tightening. Normally this gap would be filled by the arrival of the domestic crop. So if the domestic crop is late, this problem gets tighter and tighter. And perhaps at the end of the day, this is the reason why processors become more reluctant to sell at the lower prices that we're seeing just after the Tet holidays. So a tight position in Vietnam has evolved, and there are now question marks. So let's look at critical factors, particularly from the African perspective. First of all, we need to watch the kernels market. How will the kernel market react to the tighter raw cashew nut supply in Vietnam? Will kernel buyers behave differently if the market's rising? This is a very interesting point of buyer sentiment and market psychology. It's a typical situation that in falling markets, buyers tend to back away, take their time, and they'll buy at the last possible moment. They'll only buy the cover that they're absolutely obliged to buy, and they'll hope that the position gets better, i.e. prices get lower. But when the market starts to rise, they start to come in. So the markets gain momentum in that fashion. We've seen markets falling for about 3 years. So it's a big question mark as to how buyers will react, having seen 3 years of falling prices. At what moment they might decide, wait a minute, we need to change our approach here. Add to that very strong demand. Big question, we've touched on it. Farm gate prices in Vietnam are telling us that supply is tight. And the question is it later, or is it smaller, or is it both? 17th of March, you're starting to think this is a smaller crop than anticipated. And if we think about the estimates, the original trade estimate, and be very cautious of trade estimates, the initial trade estimate was 450,000 tons. Then came a more official estimate based on the hectarage and outturn of, I think it was 380. Then there was one of 360. I don't know what the current official estimate might be, if there is one updated, but I'm beginning to think that the crop is smaller than that. And I'm wondering, is the crop significantly smaller than that? And that's a big factor that we need to follow. We need to look in West Africa, how will the second crop in Cote d'Ivoire? Cote d'Ivoire is the largest grower of cashew nuts in the world. How will that second crop, which will be just coming on now, how will that fare? Will the production meet the official estimate from the CCA of 900,000 tons, which would be a record, indeed a world record crop for any single country? Or will we be looking at a slightly smaller crop? And it'll take some time before we know that, but it needs to be followed very closely. And then the question is, and this is a difficult one, because if we look at current RCN prices, they don't make a lot of sense for processors. Even with cashew 320s move back up $3, even $3 plus, RCN prices at the current time don't make a lot of sense. They're still very difficult to make a good calculation on current RCN prices and current kernels prices. So we should not necessarily conclude that a rise in kernel prices might justify any significant rise in RCN prices. It might hold farm gate prices, and it may even hold international prices, but you would get this significant pressure on RCN prices, speculative pressure, if kernels start to go up. But be careful, because it's not necessarily right that RCN prices would rise with kernels at the moment. Kernels would have to move up significantly to justify prices. Perhaps we'd have to see 315 plus to justify some of the current prices. So we need to be careful on the conclusions we draw on that. And we need to be careful because there is a prospect that a speculative bubble could evolve this year, and that could well end in serious trouble, especially on RCN, if prices are marked up too high too quickly. However, if we do see a tightening of supply in Vietnam, as seems to be the case, it's likely to bring RCN buyers into the market. And if we look at that and look at the situation in India and look at that evolving crop situation in India, we're looking at the recovery in demand, and we're looking at the prospects for a later crop, and potentially the prospects then. A later crop, as I've said, is often a smaller crop, and we need to keep a close eye on that too. So for African stakeholders at the moment, you should see more funds flow into the market for the procurement of raw cashew nuts. You should see more buying activity, but people will be hoping that this doesn't kick off the kind of speculation that we saw in 2017 and previously in 2011. That would not be good for business. It would not be healthy for the market, particularly at a time when the supply chain is in huge difficulties. The freight situation, containers are in huge difficulties, maybe not in West Africa yet, but elsewhere, and that it would not be healthy for the market in general. So we have a number of factors to watch here. We're watching the kernels market and buyers' behavior. We're watching farm gate prices in Vietnam and how they're signaling to us how the crop is evolving there. We could also say the same thing of Cambodia, by the way. Cambodia, with 250,000 tons, is moving up, probably fourth in the world this year. Obviously, as this time of year, we're always watching the situation in Cote d'Ivoire and how that crop develops. And we're watching the funds coming into the market to purchase RCN. Sometimes in cashews, much more than the fundamentals of supply and demand, it's the availability of cash to buy. It's the sentiment in the market amongst buyers that drives prices. So cashews can go up when there's a surplus, and they can go down when there's a deficit. We've seen that so many times. What I'm saying right now is that the ingredients are there for a tightening of the market and possibly a rise in cashew kernels prices. So we could say that right now the season is at a crossroads. On the basis of what we know, we could say it's at a crossroads. On the basis of what we're hearing and the sentiment that's starting to emerge, we might even say it's passed through the crossroads and we're looking at higher prices for the rest of the year. But this does need to be followed closely. It won't be, this trend will not be reversed by a lack of demand, because demand at consumer level, demand is pretty much set for the year. The only question mark on demand, in my opinion, would still be in India and how well India recovers. And we're not really talking about economic recovery in India. We're talking about whether there'll be disruption to processing and whether there'll be disruption to distribution. Those will be the big question marks, rather than whether or not consumption will recover, because it does appear that consumption last year was not as bad as expected. We only have to look at the imports of raw cashew nuts, 866,000 tons imported to India last year. So we are at a crossroads. We may even be past it, but this market needs to be closely watched in the coming weeks. So let's back off now from the short term and think about the longer term situation and ask the question, are we at a crossroads for sustainable sourcing that will bring African cashews to the forefront? Now, why am I saying sustainable sourcing? Because what I'm getting at there is that there is a change in the mindset of buyers, particularly buyers of cashew kernels. It's already happened in the mind of the consumer. Consumers are already interested in sustainable sourcing, in the impact of their purchasing decisions. They're interested in healthy food, protecting the environment, and protecting societies when they spend their money at the supermarket. Whether or not buyers are prepared to follow that with their actions in the market is the next question. And what impact that might have for African cashews. So the real thing is we need to show buyers, particularly buyers of kernels, that African cashews are sustainable and that buying African cashews makes this industry more sustainable. So let's ask ourselves a few questions on this. If you've been at this event before, you'll recognize this map, and we need to ask ourselves, is this structure sustainable? And draw your attention to the question. If this market continues to grow, based on a concentration of processing, 92% in 2 countries, continued price volatility, growing the product far from where it's processed, or vice versa in reality, processing it far from where it grows, a long chain increasing volatility, increasing risk, increasing food safety and contract risk, loss of traceability, risks to quality, and increasing environmental cost, combined with, as our volumes increase, and if you run I think we did one last week, if you run a projection on demand, you can make this reasonable calculation that we'll need 5 million tons of RCN before the end of the decade. If that continues, we have to ask, is this structure sustainable? This shipment of RCN structure is sustainable? And I ask it not only in terms of its environmental sustainability, but I also ask it in terms of its logistical sustainability. I ask it in terms of its financial sustainability. Will the ports, will the roads, will the warehouses, will the banks, will the traders be able to cope with the trade that would, on that calculation, on that projection, that would be something in the region of 2.5 million tons of cashews from West Africa alone, a further 500,000 from East Africa and rising. And just to emphasize that, we look again at our calculation of journeys, trucks, warehouses, traders, contracts, movement, quality analysis, and ocean shipment. This incredible journey from West Africa to Vietnam or India and all the way back, perhaps to North America or to Europe for consumption. In 2020, 40% of the world's cashews made this journey to market. That's remarkable by any standards. Supply chain. So one thing we've seen in the last year is an emphasis from buyers, not only in cashews, but on a whole range of products, on shorter supply chains, more manageable, more sustainable supply chains. If we take, and I'm just doing a volume calculation here, I'm not saying the processing is in place, we know it's not. But if we look at the calculation of what grows in West Africa, we can conclude that West Africa could supply all of the European and all of the North American demand for cashew kernels, if we had the processing. If we look at the transit times, West African ports to Europe, it can be done in around 15 days, and to North America, it's possible within 18 days. And yet in Europe, about 85% of our cashews come all the way from Vietnam, and most of them are African cashews. This added complexity, this added vulnerability in a crisis. And let's face it, we need to remind ourselves we were lucky in this business last year, thanks to the amazing efforts in Vietnam to keep going and to keep their processing and to keep the coronavirus at bay. The cashew market continued to function. It didn't in other countries. So we need to be careful in exactly how we look at that. But it's for sure that when we look at our business, for example, most consumers in Europe who are more and more eating cashews, most of them have never tasted a fresh cashew nut. They've probably never tasted a cashew nut that's less than maybe 5, possibly 6 months old. And that's remarkable, and they're not really aware of that. So when we look at the trend toward shorter supply chains, lower cost, more diverse supply chains, more balance, we see that the African supply chain is more sustainable than the current situation. I'm not saying that all cashews grown in Africa will be processed in Africa, not at all. I'm saying that it doesn't make sense, looking to the future, that we would ship, instead of 2.3 million tons of RCN for processing, that would be 3.5 and more than that million tons. That's not sustainable environmentally, financially, or logistically. The fourth point in terms of the sustainability of the cashew business is that when we look in Africa, particularly West Africa in recent years, the only region with growth. So these are figures for the 4 years to 2020. And you can see that essentially growth in Southeast Asia, but that's driven by Cambodia, and there's a limit to that growth due clearly to land. India for many years has had slow growth in production, and West Africa we've seen steady production growth for a long time. And if we look at that over a longer period, so here we have the regional production trends 2010 to 2019, and we look at the top one is West Africa, and you can see where that's come from and where it's got to. Vietnam with growth, but relatively slow growth. India and Cambodia, and I add Cambodia because it's now becoming a more important. It's more important in two ways. One, it's a bigger producer, but also it's more at that period of time, February, March, the kind of fulcrum on which the season turns, this time of year that we're in now. So when we look at this, if we need sustainable production growth, there's no indication that that will come anywhere other than on the continent of Africa. Another reason why African cashew nuts are more sustainable. The fifth point is what I'm calling the alignment with consumer demand. And if we look at what consumers want and what we offer them, and then we look at how our supply chain works, and we look at this complex, lacking in transparency supply chain on RCN, and we compare that with consumer needs in terms of quality, in terms of the development of the supply chain, food safety, particularly traceability and transparency, but also labor and environment compliance, we would have to ask ourselves that the average consumer, particularly European consumer, who heads out to buy cashews because they're healthy, they're natural, and in some way there's an idea that eating more vegetable protein and less meat helps the environment. But as we know, that, although it's true, it's far from as true as it could be, and it's far from as accurate as the consumer may think. So it asks the question, what would the consumer think if they knew how this business works? You know, if their picture of cashews, rather than of nice roasted 320s, if their picture was, instead of cashew trees, quality product, tasty product, if their picture was of bags of RCN on overloaded trucks heading down the road to overstretched ports, speculative prices, farmers not sure if they're going to get a low price or a high price in any given year, what would their reaction to that be? Hopefully we'll never find out because we'll see a development, but we do have to ask that question, and it would be much more sustainable if we were able to tell the consumer, yeah, this product is processed where it grows or close to where it grows. It goes directly to you, it goes quickly to you. We can show you that supply chain. We can demonstrate where it comes from. Like on other products, we can show you the farmers that grow this product. We can show you their families. And we're transparent enough to show you that our factories are compliant with what you would like to see for workers and for environmental impact. A long way to go, but there is a mismatch to my mind right now between the way the business works and the way the consumer thinks it works. Sixth point is the idea of risk and sustainability. The very simple point, if you process closer to the point of origin, the risk is reduced. And risk is a double-edged sword in this case. On the one hand, we know that the risk in the business and the sustainability of the business is increased and enhanced by processing closer to origin. But then we look at developments in African countries and we look at the way risk is presented and we look at the way risk is often overstated in terms of how the business runs. I mean, you would be not surprised with the kind of statements that you never will make money in African cashew processing. Processing factories don't work in Africa. We can't get the managers, we can't get the staff, people don't turn up for work, all of these things, you'll hear them. There are great examples that absolutely contradict all of those, and those examples are more and more emerging now. And as they do, you would hope and you would expect that the sustainability profile and the evidence that processing at origin works will come to the fore, and that will demonstrate greater sustainability of African cashews. 7 point, and now we get sort of a little bit more into the, what people often expect when you talk about sustainability. A lot of what I've spoken about so far is financial sustainability, logistical, societal. Sustainability isn't just about the environment, although that is, of course, a huge factor nowadays. There is the opportunity in African countries, particularly West Africa right now, to establish certified supply chains. That's a specific opportunity for organic cashew nuts and for certified cashew nuts in other ways. And there are many different versions other than a direct organic certification. If we look at how cashews are produced, we're looking at young trees, which means there's opportunities to improve, low use of chemical inputs generally, that the improvements in production can be not only by extension, not only by more and more trees on more and more land, but also given the relatively low yields, increasing production by improvement, technical improvement on farm, training of farmers, development of knowledge base. And we've seen good examples of that across a number of development projects right across West Africa. So increasing production in African countries doesn't necessarily mean planting more trees, as has been the case in the past. It can mean just the improvement of what's there. A big challenge, but there's really good examples of how that's worked in the past. And finally, we shouldn't forget the protection of the existing agriculture from climate change. And there's plenty of research on this. If you care to go and look at the potential impact of climate change on countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, you can see that cashews will play and can play an increasingly important role in offsetting the damage that might be done by that. To go back a little bit on some of the short-term factors. So we're thinking about the pandemic, and although we don't actually know it's a short-term factor, we hope it is. the impact of the pandemic on the supply chain has had significant impact on the way that African cashew production and processing is regarded. If we look at how the pandemic has highlighted the weaknesses and the risk in the supply chains, not just cashews, but all supply chains. And the impact this has had on buyers in focusing on the idea that they're highly dependent on a single origin. So buyers look at the market today, perhaps not the person making the day-to-day decision, but at another level, they might be looking at, we buy 90% of our cashews in one country. We used to buy them in two countries. One of those countries, India, has faded away from the export market for various and probably quite good reasons. We're highly dependent. What if something goes wrong there? And the pandemic has focused people on that kind of thinking. It's focused them on the risk in long supply chains. It's focused them on the need for transparency, for trust, for traceability. And interestingly, it's focused them on shorter supply chains, nearer supply chains, and most interestingly, more agile supply chains. So we now look at buyers who had very much been focused on the kind of, let's call it 1990s ideas of lean manufacturing, where cost was the most important thing, reducing cost. And part of that was just-in-time inventory management. So we want that product at our door at 6 o'clock Friday morning. We'll process it and it'll be on a truck out the door by 8 o'clock on Friday night. Very difficult to do that. Almost impossible to do that in the conditions of a pandemic. And this has caused people to refocus. So they're refocusing on the strength of their supply chains and how they might better organize supply chains. So they're getting pressure from consumers, they're getting pressure from food law, they're getting pressure from the sustainability of the environment and people pushing them to be more sustainable. But they're also now getting this magnified by the impact of the pandemic, which has demonstrated that these supply chains, fortunately, cashews has somehow managed during 2020, but that these supply chains are very vulnerable. And if you look at, particularly products like fresh fruit and vegetables, if you look at flowers, supply chains like this, other products, they were severely dented, and there are some serious problems have emerged over the last year. That's focusing people on more sustainable supply chains. We look at the final point, the structure of African countries, cashew producing countries. We're looking at a number of factors, economic and demographic, and I'm not qualified to go into this in much detail, but we'll just touch on these products. First of all, we know there's a young population in these countries. We know the economies are growing, maybe not last year, maybe not this year, but over the long term, the economies are growing. And we know that there is a low return on investments elsewhere, which is causing investors, particularly toward the end of last year, to look for better returns. And that draws them to interesting markets with potential. And the cashew sector in African countries is one of those interesting markets with potential. So when we look at it, there's, I think, 9 pretty strong points that say to us that we are at a crossroads. We certainly could be at the crossroads where we switch from stop-start, ad hoc development of the sector in African countries to a coherent, structured, long-term development. But we do need to get this message out a little bit better. We could be at this crossroads. And some buyers and investors are very interested in that, and some see it, but probably not enough. And within the sector, many people still think very short term. And that goes for processors, regulators, support organizations. it's a natural human nature thing, but we have to force ourselves to think of the longer term and to think that solving the issue today, selling those raw cashew nuts and getting the cash in and moving it back up the supply chain is great. But in the longer term, the industry could be severely damaged. So if you take a position where the industry continues to develop, consumption continues to rise quickly, eventually this unsustainable supply chain starts to creak, as we've seen it once or twice. We've seen that happen. And then prices are forced up because of that failure in the supply chain. The consumer starts to lose interest, and we could, in the longer term, end up damaging the industry. And to change that, I think that development of processing in particular, and I mention processing because I think quite a good job is done on education on the production side, but in processing it needs education and technical support. So yes, we are at the crossroads, but to my mind, it's important that we get the message out to more buyers and more investors, not just about you should come to Africa to help us out, but you should come to Africa because it makes sense for you to do business there. We need to change our way of thinking, and we need to invest more and more in the education of stakeholders in the sector and people coming into the sector, and better technical support through factories as well as production, and for trade as well as for processing. So two crossroads, one short term, the market, one longer term based on the sustainability of a supply chain based on African cashew production and African cashew processing. Perhaps what we really need to change is the way we think about it. So thanks very much for listening. If anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, to discuss them.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's good to go through this kind of analysis to know what is happening, also what to expect in the coming periods, particularly the two types of crossroads that we are in now, more around the market, but also with the sustainability of the value chain. And I want us to unpack the sustainability aspect, particularly issues to do with the supply chain. I want to find out from you whether it is possible to discuss a bit the economics of that supply chain, why it is still profitable to buy raw nuts from Africa and process in Asia, and then to put back on supermarket shelves in Europe and America. So we want to know what are these components of the supply chain, and then how we begin to tackle them. You talked about transportation, where the transport costs are going up by 1 to 3%. You talked about. There is also issues of labor efficiency. There's also so that in terms of processing cost per ton, the differences in the different geographical areas, and then the issues of the efficiency of the technologies that are being employed. So can we begin to unpack this sustainability question, and to know why still we are having this issue, and how governments and also private sector and development partners can begin to address various aspects of this long and inefficient supply chain that we are started with. Thank you.
Well, I mean, looking at this slide, you can see the number of movements and the number of transactions that RCN goes through during the 40% of the world's cashews making this journey. I mean, if you think about 13 movements by truck, 9 warehouses, 8 middlemen, 8 contracts, 5 different handling and warehousing, 8 quality tests, and 4 ocean voyages. All of those have a cost. I did a calculation recently, estimating, and I think I was conservative in this estimate, but estimating that the cost of this RCN chain, excluding profit margin, was about $800 million. So it could be that the cost of this RCN chain is about $1 billion every year. And that saving should be directly input into economies in West Africa. Now, why does it currently work that way? It currently works that way because processors, especially in Vietnam, have managed to get themselves to a position where their cost of processing is low enough to support the import of raw cashew nuts. This happened before. This happened back in the early 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, when Indian processors did exactly the same thing at a time when cashews were mainly grown in East Africa and processed there in Mozambique and Tanzania. And the movement of for different reasons than now, but much more political reasons at that time, processing shifted to southern India. And that was based on excellent processing, excellent. In fact, it wasn't so much the use of technology, it was the use of high levels of skilled labor, and mainly based on cost. At that time, the Indian domestic market wasn't anywhere near the size it is today. So the current chain is based on the mismatch between the level of investment in the two processing countries, Vietnam and India, and the level of investment in West Africa. So for many years, it would be very difficult to establish a cashew factory because it would be based on recruiting huge numbers of workers. So you might need 4 or 5 or more thousand workers to develop a significant scale cashew factory. Very difficult task. But the advent of the technology has changed that. And that has happened over the past 20 years. But in terms of its availability internationally and to African investors, it's really only taken the last 10 years that it's picked up. So now you have a situation where you can ask the question, why not? Why not can you establish a factory based on technology in an African country that can meet the costs in Asian countries? Now, okay, you'd certainly have a number of factors there. So you have things like the cost of utilities, which is very difficult to address. You have to expect that you're not going to be able to change the price of electricity because you build a cashew factory. The use of byproducts is another key factor. The market for byproducts, so the market for CNSL and the market for shell, is not as well developed in African countries as it would be in India, for example. So when we look at this situation, we see a position where the competitiveness of cashew kernels is based on excellent growing at relatively low cost and excellent processing in Vietnam at relatively low cost. The argument would be, well, processing should either be close to the market, as it is in India, or close to the origin. And for Vietnam, it's only for that 350,000 tons they grow themselves, plus the Cambodian product. So let's say somewhere around about 600,000 tons is grown close to where it's processed. The rest of the 2.1, 2.2 million tons they process is imported. And so this is the imbalance. Now, the challenge is, can we establish a situation accepting that it's going to be very difficult to match efficient Vietnamese processing cost? Can we establish a situation where the difference between processing in Africa and processing in Vietnam is less than that $1 billion I spoke about, the cost of bringing that RCN to Vietnam for processing or to India for processing? The answer to my mind is, of course we can. If you look at it, it's such a lot of money. Now, if we think about that, if we can close that gap, so if it costs, let's say, for sake of argument, $350 to move the product from West Africa to Vietnam for processing, and the cost, that means that if we can get the difference between the cost of processing in the two regions below $350 or significantly below $350, processing can work in West Africa. And that's possible now due to the advent of machines and technology. Now, in the meantime, we should also recognize that due to the fact that there is a high on cost, a high cost of delivery to process, the price at the farm gate is lower. So effectively, you can ask the question, who pays the margin that the international trade in RCN needs to function? And it needs a profit margin. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them making money. They should make money. Who pays the costs for moving that product from West Africa to processing in Vietnam? And effectively, it's the farmer. Because everyone else in that chain is one way or another, an intermediary, a middleman, whatever you want to call them. So effectively, it's the farmer. So you would, in theory, see a situation where if processing were local, the farmers should earn more. If farmers earn more, they're likely to produce more. If they produce more, the unit cost should fall, processing becomes more efficient. And plonk that down into a market where demand is, I mean, you can say cashew demand is rampant at the moment. You look at the figures in Europe and in the United States. I don't know how long they will continue, but I do know that demand is growing really quickly. And so to take advantage of that, it seems to me that the key factor that's missing is efficient processing. And that's where we come to questions about the scale of a factory, management of a factory, the financing of the factory, and the technical support and education. And of course, issues around about the regulation of sectors and the regulation of the establishment of factories. And in some countries, fortunately, tremendous support for the establishment of factories. So can it work? I think it can, but it needs a close focus on processing, because for me, that's, and I think for most people, that's the missing link at the moment.
Thank you, Jim. Before I continue with the sustainable, I see two hands up. Mario Alfredo Mendoza. Let me allow him. Hello, Mario. Hello, Mario. There is also somebody with cabinet d'études. Please, can you also speak up if you are ready? But Jim, yeah, hello, yes.
Bonjour.
Hello? Oui, hello.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Oui, bonjour.
Oui.
C'est M. Bamba. Nous sommes un cabinet d'études d'appui conseil au monde rural, spécialement dans la chaîne de valeur en Acad au Mali. Ma question est la suivante. J'ai bien écouté l'exposé très brillant et on a appris beaucoup de choses. Maintenant, ma question se rapporte surtout au fruit même du cajou. Parce qu'on a tendance à oublier que le cajou a deux fruits. Il y a la noix, bien sûr, mais il y a le pédoncule qu'on appelle la pomme de cajou qui ne se ressort pas tellement dans le circuit de commercialisation. Et quelles sont les dispositions prises pour valoriser la pomme de cajou et pour que le paysan ait encore plus de valeur ajoutée? Et ça, c'est la première question. La deuxième question, par rapport à la noix brute, nous donnons plus d'importance à la noix compte tenu des dérivés surtout tirés de cette noix. Mais est-ce qu'il y a un mécanisme qui fait qu'une fois que le paysan il sèche sa noix, toutes les valeurs ajoutées par rapport aux dérivés, est-ce qu'il y a un retour pour le paysan? Est-ce qu'il y a un mécanisme pour ça? Je vais parler de la coque qui est transformée en briquette de charbon, du kérosène qui est tiré de tout ça, beaucoup d'autres sous-produits qui sont tirés et qu'au retour, le paysan à la base qui fait tout le travail en amont, est-ce qu'il y a une possibilité, un mécanisme de faire un retour sur le paysan, sur chaque valeur ajoutée sur la noix brute? Ça, c'est mes deux questions.
Hello, Jim.
Yeah.
Yes, so the question first of all has to do with the fruits. It seems the whole discussion is on the other aspects of the cashew tree, but nothing essentially on the fruits and how it can also be made beneficial, particularly to the farmers. But then the second part is more on the benefits that can come back to farmers after the kernel has been processed. Is there any way that they can create some kind of biofuel or any, byproduct processing out of the let's say the cashew waste after the kernel has been extracted? So these are the two main questions. More underlying benefits to farmers largely from fruits and also from the byproduct processing.
Well, all the evidence tends to be that if you have efficient processors locally based, they have much more developed relationships with farmers, and they're much more likely to reward farmers better for the raw material that the farmer supplies. So the development of a more integrated supply chain is not only in the interest of the consumer or the processor, but it's also in the interest of the farmer, because there's much more opportunity to benefit. Just consider the thought that if an RCN buyer comes to the farm once a year to pick up some cashews, maybe 2-3 visits over the season, there's no other relationship there. I mean, there may be at the local level, but at the assembler level, there's no other relationship. Whereas a processor is there in the region all the time. Their business is there. People may well work in the factories. People may well be involved in other businesses which are supplying the factories or benefiting. So the relationship between a processor and a farmer is much more likely to benefit farmers in the longer run. Efficient processors are much more likely to compete for raw material, and that's likely to mean that prices to farmers will be fairer. With regard to the use of byproducts, I mentioned that, and for sure, the use of byproducts is important. If you can valorize all of the byproducts, that makes processing more efficient. That means you can pay the farmer more money. I don't think that at the moment that there, if I understood the question well, I don't think that there is an opportunity right now for farmers to directly benefit from the processing of byproducts. The processing of byproducts is technically quite difficult, and it's quite demanding and can be quite dangerous. So I think that that's best left to processors to do that, but they should of course reflect their overall success in the value and the investment in the supply chain and in the farmers. With regard to cashew fruits, I think that first of all we should realize that there is a reason why cashew fruits are not developed as a product widely around the world. We should recognize that cashew fruit is not the answer to all of the problems, but we should also remember that it is quite a decent product and it is a product that has potential. But technically it's quite difficult. It doesn't last long. It needs to be processed. It's not suitable other than for a few days to be consumed as a fruit. And that the fruit market itself, especially in West Africa, is a really well supplied with excellent mangoes, with all kinds of pineapple, you name it. There's so many different fruits that are available and go to waste for lack of processing. So we have to be careful if we look at fruits as the panacea, the answer to all our problems. They're not. But there is an opportunity in the processing and consumption of fruit. And yes, that should benefit farmers too. We should also remember that we have to make carefully balance between the needs of getting good quality nuts, which are high value products, eventually kernels in the range $6,000 a ton, or sacrificing some of that quality in order to recover fruits, which may well be worth $250, $300 a ton. So we need to balance that.
Thank you, Jim. Now to go back to the issue of the cost differential between West Africa, let's say Africa and Asia. There is a question here, Musab, who wants to know how, and he says practically, can we reduce the processing cost in West Africa, particularly in Senegal, to have a competitive price for mid-sized factories? And then he goes on to ask, are they a good market for cashew nut shell oil, shell and charcoal cashew? I think it's more, are there a good market for cashew nut shell oil, shells and cashew nut? And how to get some information on such markets.
Look, processing cost, this is a huge topic. We could do a whole series of webinars on this alone, and we would need some more expertise than I've got. But what I would say is that I think the key things for competitive processing is to pick the right scale, the scale that suits a mix of equipment, good sourcing of that equipment, good business planning from the very outset, employment of people with potential to be trained as managers, and the intake of skilled expertise from outside initially if it's not available locally. I think partly over the years we may well have looked at cashew processing and perhaps underestimated the challenge, often seeing it as an extension of trading activity, which it's not. So people going into cashew processing have to consider they're going into the food business, they're going into food manufacturing. They're not going into some kind of a business that's an add-on to a trading activity. And those different things are the key areas. I would say the first stage to reducing the cost of processing is to build to the right scale. And the second stage is to make sure that in doing that, you've conducted the right business plan and located in the right area. There is a good market for cashew nut shell oil and for shell. One of the problems in African countries is that that market may not be on your doorstep. You may have to go looking for that market, and it is quite difficult to get good information on that market because it's quite a small market, but nonetheless it's quite buoyant. And what's most interesting is that the range of uses of these products, the demand for natural phenols, for example, is expanding, and it is likely that the demand for these products will increase in the coming years. Having said that, don't forget that if you start to process in West Africa, you're not adding more product to the market. All you're doing is processing product locally that's currently processed far away in Asia. So you're not creating new supply. You're just moving the position of the processing. And therefore, the current market, which is showing high demand for all of these products, is likely to continue. But we need to access it, and we need to produce the product in the right way, pack it in the right way so that it's accessible for the market and to communicate that. I think if you want more information on byproducts, a good place to start would be to talk to the African Cashew Alliance. And you will find a number of studies online. Read them, talk to the ACA, and you could start to build a profile on those products from there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, the last 2 years, we had a study on byproducts, cashew byproducts funded by the African Development Bank, and the report is available. We had to do this together with the Way for Africa. So we will see how probably we bring back another session on the cashew byproducts. I see also a demand for more on the processing, and as you mentioned, Jim, the economics of it will take probably a whole separate forum, and that is something that we may have to also present in one of our short sessions that we have planned in the year. But there is Venkat here who wants to know. I think these are things that you might have touched on already. How is the RCN new season in Africa so far? And will production exceed that of last year? You've talked about the situation in Cote d'Ivoire, but I think it is more for emphasis. But again, he also asks, African prices in recent weeks has gone up. Do you see the trend continuing forward, especially whether it will also drive with it an increase in the RCN prices?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question, Ernest.
So the first part of the question is how the RCN season in Africa has gone so far.
Okay, and then you're asking about the price of kernels as well as RCN.
And then the second one is about cashew kernel prices.
Okay. Sorry, I lost you for a moment there. As far as I know, I'd say you follow the ACA splits on a weekly basis and you get quite good updates on the crop situation. My understanding as things stand is that if we go around the region, Nigeria looks good with good quality, Benin looks quite good with good quality. There were some question marks in Ghana as to the quality, whether it was meeting the normal high standards there, and as to the size of the crop. We've mentioned Côte d'Ivoire during the course of the discussion already, which is obviously the biggest producer in the region. It does look to me as if, on what we know now, that crops in West Africa should be better than last year. We would expect that that would be the case. A couple of question marks, which we'll see as the second crop comes on. But I think it's fair to say that on what we know now, crops in West Africa look not to have suffered in the way that crops in Asia may have. Now, with regard to the pricing on kernels, I think that kernels prices, again, looking at today's market, kernels prices could steady up. I don't think we should get carried away on this. I don't think we're looking at any kind of a price spiral. The ingredients are there for higher prices, but to my mind, not for a speculative bubble right now. But we need to be cautious on this when we look at RCN. Kernels prices can steady, but the calculation is still quite tight for processors, and they may well be reluctant to pay up for RCN as things stand. So that needs to be carefully watched. If we have a good crop in West African countries and we have good demand, it doesn't necessarily mean that the international price for RCN will start to move up. Kernels still would have some way to go to catch up with RCN. If you see kernels today, if we say that range is, let's say, $2.90 to $3.10 for 320s FOB, depending on the quality of the processor, if you see that go beyond 320, again for 320s FOB, then I think that an increase in price of RCN would be justified. Other than that, prices of RCN should remain relatively stable. I think, I mean, what should and does happen in cashews are often two different things. But I wouldn't be getting the idea that speculating in RCN is a great idea right now. But I would watch the situation as it evolves in Cambodia and in Vietnam to get clues on the direction of RCN prices.
Thank you very much, Jim. Let me remind you all that the session is being recorded and broadcast live on YouTube, Microsoft Teams, and Facebook Live. So we have other participants also sending information in there. But Jim, if you look at the sustainability question, especially your seventh point on sustainable certified supply chain opportunity, my question is, how are specialty markets for, let's say, organic cashew and others evolving? Especially if you look at the rising demand, what composition of it is it made of, and actually how is it informing this growth in demand?
Well, I think the first thing we should say is that the extension and growth in the organic cashew kernel market is restricted by the availability of supply. There's simply not enough supply to meet demand, and that's causing the market to be relatively stable as a result. There has been big increases in demand in North America and in Europe over the past 2 or 3 years. And I think if we were to have more product available, that we would see a very fast growth in the cashew kernel market. It has been strong. We are seeing growth in supply, but we're not seeing growth in supply that anywhere comes close to meeting the potential for the growth in demand. And thus you see the premiums for organic kernels being relatively steady and sustained at relatively attractive levels. I feel we can expect that to continue. I think that there will be more demand. I think when you look at particularly the organic sector, it's much more likely that buyers will get involved in the supply chain to stimulate supply and to stimulate doing business in the right way and the right kind of certification. There are a couple of areas here that we need to consider. That it needs to be certified organic product. The supply chain needs to be certified. It's not just, testing product for chemicals. It's actually certifying farmers and farmer groups, and that needs a degree of organization and investment. It is a way to add value for farmers. Someone asked how do farmers benefit? Well, organic certification would benefit farmers on prices. But that also needs good technical support, because if you don't do it properly, you could well find that there's a drop off in yield, but that can be addressed too. I suspect that there are a lot of people looking at moving to certified organic production of cashew kernels, and they're hesitating a little bit because they're wondering, is the market there? Talk to some of the buyers. We can put you in touch with some of the buyers of organic products if you want to do that. And there are opportunities to make good partnerships. It seems to be a little bit easier to make partnerships in those segments. I think organic is the one that's growing, that's the one that's most likely to continue to grow quickly. There are a whole range of other certified supply chain opportunities. And indeed, many buyers are now considering putting in their own supply chain certification to guarantee products. This is another reason why cashew production in African countries is more sustainable, or let's say cashew processing close to origin. It's not just Africa, it makes sense anywhere to process close to where the product grows. So I think we will see this grow. I think demand will grow. I would encourage anyone who has ambitions in this area to do their research, talk to some of the buyers, get the buyers involved from the very beginning so that you have a good understanding of what they want. And that opportunity is there. If you're establishing new trees on land that hasn't had anything on it before, if you have young trees, if you have low use of chemicals amongst your suppliers, or no use of chemicals, as is often the case, you could be in a position to get organic certification, and that will be rewarded by buyers, and that investment will have a relatively quick return.
But Jim, really, is there any price markup or any real differentiation in the market for prices for organic cashew?
Well, I don't like to get nailed on price discussions here, but I will. So at the moment, if we say the average price for top quality 320s is somewhere around about $2.95, $3 for sake of discussion, and I'm talking top quality. The price for organic is probably $3.75, something like that. So the answer to your question, Ernest, is absolutely yes. That hasn't always been the case, but it has been the case in the course of last year. And I know this for a fact. There's no question, I've seen the contracts. So there is an organic price premium. It is being maintained, and buyers are, they're pretty happy to pay that. It makes sense for them.
Very good. Before we move into the impact of the El Nino, the climate change issues, the next question that I want to find out about is to do with East Africa. In all this situation where the crop is not certain in terms of the levels of the harvest in certain regions, Africa not an exception. What is the situation with the East African crop? Is it all sold, or are there some stock in Tanzania, in Mozambique, as we speak?
I think most of the RCN is sold. The Tanzanian crop 2020, 2021 was a little bit disappointing. There has been really good growth in production in Tanzania over the longer term. We have seen some really excellent crops in recent years. This year was a little bit disappointing, and I think what was available is sold. In Mozambique, I'm less certain. I think most of the RCN that will be sold as RCN is sold. Processors are working away on their processing, of course, and they will probably have some product to offer. But if we get down to maybe the nitty-gritty of the question, is there likely to be an offering from East Africa into the market at this time? No, not one that makes any significant difference. Indeed, it's interesting to note that this is the first for 3 years where we haven't had this hangover of stock either lying in warehouses in Tanzania or shipped to India or Vietnam towards the end of the calendar year and to be used in the following year. So that factor has been taken out of the market, and probably that was something that weighed heavily on the market, that change. You know, we did end one year where there was 200,000 tons left in Tanzania at one point, apparently unsold, but that's gone now. So I don't think that we're going to see major arrival of unsold material from East Africa to cause any additional supply into the market at this time.
Jim, now let me move to an issue that has come up from our analysts, and as they will, everyone will read also in our cashew splits, Africa splits. There is the issue of shortage of liquidity by buyers of raw cashew nuts in Africa, so they are not getting funds or let's say financing from their exporters or the exporters they are linked to. But it looks like India really probably is not coming to the market strongly, and Vietnam rather a vast growth in there. So what is causing the shortage of financing? Is it that maybe Vietnam is buying only in certain specific countries, and those countries that had traditionally relied on Indian purchases are the ones suffering? There is a big issue there, and we need to understand what is going on with lack of financing for purchases in Africa.
Yeah, it may well be that Indian buyers are coming to the market a little bit slower at the moment. There's some lack of clarity on the trade position in India. And if they are coming a little bit more slowly than usual, you would expect there to be a lack of liquidity in countries where Indian buyers are particularly active early in the season, for example, Benin or Ghana. As the market changes, it would be an expectation now that we would see more funds come to the market. You know, that we often hear of a shortage of funds, but as soon as the market sentiment starts to change, that tends to get resolved relatively quickly. And this is another aspect of, you know, a lack of local processing. It does mean that the supply chain for RCN is a very long one, but also the availability and the supply of working capital into the system, that's also quite a long chain, and it depends on businesses that are located far away. And until they've decided that they're going to inject funds for exporters and advances, there's going to be a shortage of cash. But it would be concerning if there was too much cash in the market, chasing too little product at this particular moment in time, because that could cause a situation where RCN prices would go up without justification on the base price of kernels, which they eventually go to produce. I think this position will alleviate as the next 2-3 weeks unfolds.
All right. There is also Andre Nanke, and I'm happy when we get questioners from also Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, and Gambia, because that is also another sub-region of the West African area with a different crop season, slightly different crop season and different dynamics. And the question is more, what is the FOB reference price for West African RC? And I know it's an area you don't want to go in there, but more, what are some of the dynamics, just to play it up a bit, what are some of the dynamics you picked today on the cashew sector in the three countries in that region? And then what opportunities you see in the light of how the market or industry is evolving globally?
I haven't seen any prices for Guinea-Bissau or RCN yet. I haven't seen anyone brave enough to guess at what the price will be. I understand that the crop should be a good crop this year, but we'll have to wait to see some prices in the market. Any prices that are mentioned are essentially speculative prices at this time. The dynamics, well, we're looking at a situation where supply would appear to be tightening. We're looking at a situation where it looks like, although the season has maybe internationally got off to quite a slow start, that will accelerate. So I'd anticipate a good demand. The dynamics we mentioned that apply to the sector as a whole also apply to Guinea-Bissau or any other country. Maybe the benefit from a Guinea-Bissau point of view would be that you've got, before that crop starts to roll in, there's a little bit more time to have a look and to see how things are going. I would be carefully observing over the next 2 weeks these 6 factors that we put on the market slide. How the kernel market reacts. Will kernels buyers start to change their behavior? Farm gate prices in Vietnam and the crops elsewhere. So 2 factors, I think, from a Guinea-Bissau point of view, I would be watching especially carefully would be the Indian situation, Indian crop development and demand in India, and the crops in countries further east, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana particularly, to see how that develops. So if we're looking at, I mean, right now you would start the season looking at with an optimistic outlook for further west. I think quality RCN will be in good demand this year. I don't think that we should expect prices much higher than last year, at least towards the close of last season. And I would also be carefully watching the situation with regards to the availability of freight and freight containers. I don't think there's a big issue in West Africa today, but that could change.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And I'm resisting the temptation to predict where prices will be. I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, I think it is even too early. With the season just about starting there, you don't want to do this. I think we will look at the dynamics as time goes on, and then to see how also the production will be in that country to know really the effect on prices there. But Jim, just to take the discussions a bit further into the market itself, and to also look at, let's say, even if you look at the broker segment of the value chain and the infrastructure mechanisms that they have adopted in buying from different areas, is Africa really also a very easy terrain for them to deal in terms of exchange rate uncertainties, organizing the product and shipment and the rest? We want to clear that bit also, because there is also the worry that when it comes to that aspect of the preparedness of Africa, little is said about it, but then there are big challenges faced by those who are already picking kernel out of Africa today.
We're talking here about RCN, Ernest?
No, we're talking here about kernel.
About kernels. Well, okay, so let's first of all say it's important that, first of all, the perception of how difficult it is to do business in Africa amongst buyers of kernels is probably worse than the reality, because the situation has moved on and changed, and the ability to do business has improved. Having said that, there's a long way to go, I think, in the cashew sector in improving, as we talked about, the education, the technical capacity of processors, of people that work in processing plants, to improve their approach to the market. And one of the things that I think is often neglected is the development of good practices in marketing and business development. People, you know, they work on building a factory, obtaining the money, putting the machines in, technically trying to get it right, and they forget to develop their ability in sales and marketing. As a result, they often end up in a position where they end up, you know, dealing with the first person that comes along who may not be the right client. And it takes that little bit of additional thought, expertise, and skill to get marketing right. It's not a case of, I'll build this factory and buyers will just turn up. Sure, buyers will turn up. But you may well end up wondering 5 years later why you've got a warehouse full of broken cashews, why your prices don't match the prices made by other companies. And that's often down to the fact that the marketing and sales performance of the business is not fully developed. So excellence in business is as important technically as it is sales and marketing. From a kernels buyer's point of view, it is probably easier to pick up the phone, send an email, and get an answer back from a supplier in Vietnam, because that sector is developed. There are more brokers, traders, indirect channels active there. However, there are enough kernels buyers who are interested in developing supplies from other origins, but we've got to go out and tell them about it. If you talk to people, if you talk to kernels buyers here in Europe, many of them are not aware of the opportunity in African countries. Some of them are not even aware of this difficult RCN supply chain. We need to get out there and talk to them about that. Processors need to do that. Governments need to do that. Trade associations need to do that. And I think that in terms of buying kernels, it is, let's say, the difference between buying kernels in Africa and kernels in Vietnam is not as great as the difference in buying RCN. Buying RCN in African countries is a really tough job. Buying kernels, because you're dealing with a processor, tends to be a little bit more straightforward. So I think that we do need a lot of development, investment. I would look to governments to get more involved in building the profile of businesses, in supporting businesses and encouraging businesses in areas other than investment and technical, in the sense of process technical, to embrace building the brand. That's really what needs to be done. The brand needs to be built.
The last area that I want to touch on has to do with the impact of the climate change on production. And to help us do that, I have Professor Peter Masawi. Professor Masawi is a researcher who has been with the Nalendele Agricultural Research Institute in Tanzania in the past, and today working with the Ministry of Agri in Zambia, supporting them with the World Bank cashew project. So at this point, Professor Masawi, can you kindly join us so that we go a bit into what we are observing in terms of the impact of the El Nino on production in West Africa, but then also globally, we see also the same situation in Vietnam. We see the same situation in Cambodia. So welcome, Professor Masawi. Can you please unmute your mic as your mic is muted? Yes, thank you, Professor Masawi. So please welcome. We have seen and heard from Jim how the El Nino is affecting production of cashew in Africa, and also we saw in other areas. So if you can shed some light on the impact, and again, where we are heading to with that in terms of the long-term production, and what governments and countries and other producers can begin to do. Thank you very much and welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ernest. It is true that the El Nino issue has become a serious problem even in East Africa of recent. And Tanzania, Mozambique were more affected than any other country because the change in weather affected the national cashew production. We lost almost 30% of the expected crop. And basically what is happening is that majority of the cashew trees which have a prolonged flowering period could not produce. Only those ones with short duration of nut picking, that flowering earlier, fruiting earlier, managed to drop all their crops. So that is why definitely when we are selecting for cashew varieties, we normally advise to have the earlier crop rather than having the varieties that they spread their yields throughout the harvesting season. In many countries now, you will find that majority of the countries where disease is a problem, the problem is more serious. It's more serious in the sense that when you have sporadic rains, a disease called the blight will come and wipe the whole nuts on the tree, or anthracnose will come when during the fruiting season, and all the apples and nuts, they remain hanging on the tree. This was noted in this season, and the majority of the farmers were complaining a lot. Some of the farmers were attempting even to pick physically the nuts from the tree because they could see the apples are mature, they see the nuts are mature. But in reality, when you do cutting test, you will find that the kernels inside are very, very poor quality. So it is very important now to make sure that we are planting the right material. Otherwise, if we depend on the trees which are just planted by
Hello, Professor Masawi.
is majority of the earlier fruiting, earlier flowering crops, they were not heavily affected because by the time when the weather was changing somewhere, somehow, already they had harvested more than 60% of the crop. This was the scenario.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Masawi, and thanks for taking the time to come out of your busy meeting to shed some light on this for us. We will see whether there are questions, but then I'll go back now to Jim Fitzpatrick, and maybe we'll have in future a much longer session also with you, Professor, for issues of this nature in terms of research in the subject, how it is going to be able to address this. Thank you very much. Jim Fitzpatrick.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Jim Fitzpatrick.
Hi, Ernest.
Yes. It's good to have had the intervention also from Professor Masawi. He's still around. If you have some questions for him, otherwise then we will take the last questions on our discussions here today, and then we put the curtains down. Jim.
Yes, I think we need to follow this crop situation very carefully. I just want to make it clear for everyone that we're asking questions here about the crops in various countries, and it's really good to get an expert opinion from Professor Masawi. Well, let's be clear, we're not here predicting that the crops will be necessarily very poor across the world. What we're saying is keep a close eye on the situation. If you're in the cashew business, keep a close eye on this current situation. Markets are volatile. The crop situation during the month of March, particularly when crops are later than expected in Asia, the position can be volatile. So the message from ACA is make sure you get good market information on the crop developments. We will try and provide you with what we can, and bear that in mind. But the message is not that this crop is in serious trouble. We have to be careful with that. What the message is that there's a question mark over the crop right now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim, for the emphasis. Now I see a hand up. Cabinet d'Etudes, is there any question for Professor Masawi or for Jim? Hello?
Maybe no one.
Okay, fine. If there's no question, then I think at this stage, I would like to thank Professor Masawi, and then also invite from Jim his final words, concluding words for the presentation he has done today.
Thank you.
And what again we should be looking out for in the coming fortnight.
Thank you, Ernest.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Masawi.
Thanks, Peter. Nice to hear from you. What to be looking out for in the next couple of weeks? Watch kernels prices carefully. Watch where particularly if you get those reports from brokers and traders, look to see what level of price is being offered in Vietnam, and especially look at the difference between the lower end processor and the higher end processor. So at the moment, you've got quite a broad range, maybe from 290 to 310. Keep keep an eye on that. If you see forward prices going up, if you see the price from the top processors marked up, that could be a signal that the market price is rising. Carefully watch RCN prices, but don't expect that RCN prices will instantly change or move upwards just because kernels do. That's really important. I think there may be an opportunity here for African processors to cover their raw material for the coming year at reasonable prices. So it's important to get working capital in place and to look at the kernels market for opportunities. This is a crossroads, in my opinion. It is not by any means clear which direction the market will go, but it is possible that it would return to the kind of upward trend that we last saw a few years ago now. We last saw in 2016, before we got that incredibly volatile year of 2017, and afterwards the hangover from that particular party. So watch it carefully. I'd be pretty optimistic on this year, but it's not a time for, in my opinion, it's not a time for taking big risks either way. It's not a good time for speculation, but it could be a great time to be in the cashew business.
Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. It's a pleasure having you, and we look forward to having you in the next fortnight. And at this point, let me also appreciate participants for being with us in this learning journey and making sure that we dispel all the rumors or the fiction in the industry and then get a better grasp of the way it is performing, and then to be able to make well-informed decisions. My gratitude also, and on behalf of our Cashew Alliance, goes to Intersnack, ComCashew, SNI, Cashew Info, Pro Cashew, and Technicep Benin Cashew for supporting us to make this possible. Thank you very much, and see you again. As always, we will leave the platform active for a couple more minutes so that you can connect with people on the platform and do business the way you want. Thank you very much, and see you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.